IAGS is delighted to have you here. We are delighted to be together for these 3 days. Yesterday we started very well in a lovely reception and occasion to network and meet again. It's a beginning, and it's the first time in Washington. Many of us working and living in the area feel that this is really the beginning of something that is going to last. An encounter between high-quality scholarship and impact, effectiveness in genocide studies, in genocide prevention, in structures and systems that will allow us as human family to respond to the threats of genocide more effectively. It's a collective enterprise that requires to be international, and we are delighted that our keynote speaker comes not from this country, not because we don't want Americans to speak, but because it's important for the conversation to be as large and inclusive as possible. As my accent reveals, I'm not Irish, and I am delighted that this country gave me not only a warm welcome 15 years ago when I came for the peace process in Mozambique following an exceptional transformation that the country in Southern Africa had, but also a job and a way to engage scholarship, keeping my roots in practical work. I am delighted to be joined today by Greg Stanton, somebody who has struggled against genocide for such a long time, and with whom we are launching, experimenting, imagining something new, actually involving faith traditions and alliances that do take into account the interconnectedness of the human family that needs to respond to genocide and genocide threats effectively. Greg will probably speak more about this in the future. We'll have 3 days together, but for the moment, just let me welcome you all very warmly, very thankfully in many ways. As Diana said yesterday, we apologize for any shortcomings, and we discovered that many of our friends were made American on their name tag. We, again, are ready to make amendments and corrections, and if there is anything we can do to make your stay more enjoyable and effective, let us know. I do believe that these 3 days will be somehow of a challenge, because we unfortunately do not have everything in one place. So we'll have this opening ceremony here and the banquet here. But everything else, the 2 days of the actual work in groups, in panels, in sessions, will be in the so-called original building that happened to be just one building on the left of where we are speaking now. And as you know, sometimes things happen, you are unlucky, the door that literally gives us access to that is closed. So you need to do a little bit of a tour. And then we will go on Wednesday to the US Congress for a closing that will bring us even closer to the decision-making processes of this national capital. But we will give you more specification on that soon. For the moment, let's welcome Greg Stanton and our keynote speaker. Thank you.
It's a real great pleasure to open this 8th biennial meeting of the International Association of Genocide Scholars. I have to confess, it's also a great relief. I'm really thrilled about the incoming executive board, and I'm also very thrilled that today we will be turning those offices over to them. But I won't speak anything this morning. Instead, I simply want to introduce you to our keynote speaker. If I tried to read his bio, it would take about the time of his speech, so I won't. Professor Irwin Cutler, Member of Parliament in Canada, is among the leading human rights lawyers in the world. He has been the head of the Canadian government's justice program. He was the Attorney General of Canada. He was re-elected in 1999 with 92% of the votes. And that was with opposition. So, this is not some kind of a third world election, where you read that they got 99% of the votes. It just shows the strength of his regard in Canada. In his work as Minister of Justice and Attorney General, he appointed 2 outstanding women justices to the Supreme Court of Canada for the first time. He has made Canada one of the leading countries in criminalizing trafficking of persons and pursuing international justice as a priority, in making Canada one of the few states in the world that exercises universal jurisdiction over genocide. And most recently, and he will speak about this, I'm sure, in his speech, the very first conviction under a universal jurisdiction statute in Canada for a Rwandan genocidist. He has a long career as a constitutional comparative law scholar. He has written hundreds of articles. Most recently, and I think for me at least, most significantly, he's been a noted peace activist in attempting to bring peace in the Middle East. And he's also been an early warning pioneer. He has been among the first to show that hate speech is, in fact, one of the most telling early warning signs for future genocide. In fact, he has made that the underlying theme of his talk today. And so I introduce to you the distinguished Honorable Irwin Cutler, Member of Parliament in Canada, who will speak to us on the danger of state-sponsored incitement to genocide.
Thank you, Greg, for those very kind words of introduction. Just one corrective that my son, if he were here, would oblige me to state. When I was elected with 92% of the vote, I should mention that he, at that time, in 1999, was 12 years of age, very upset that I was leaving academe to go into politics. And so he was walking around at the nominating convention, very morose, almost angry, and a journalist saw him and he said, what do you think of your dad running for Parliament? And he answered as follows, which was on the front page of the newspapers the next day. He said, I think my dad's crazy. He's an law professor, he's in human rights, that I can understand. What does he want to go to Parliament for? Nothing ever happens there, they don't do anything. If anything, some of them become corrupt, and there's a Monica Lewinsky waiting for him around the corner. 6 weeks later, when I did, and that was the prologue to the 92%, when I did get elected with 92% of the vote, the journalist called up my son and said, well, what do you think of your dad now? He got 92% of the vote, and my son answered as follows, Donald Duck running in this riding for the Liberals would have gotten 92% of the vote. If my dad lost, that would have been a story. So that's the humbling riposte that I'm obliged to share with you. References made to that particular item. I'm delighted to be here and to participate in the common cause which brings us together, which I take to be the struggle against hate, against injustice, against impunity, and against the crime whose name we should even shudder to mention, namely genocide. And this is part of the larger struggle for human rights, for human dignity, for the responsibility to prevent and the duty to act, which is consecrated in the Genocide Convention, in the principles of the international judgments that followed, including recently in the Mugesera judgment in Canada, and as Greg Stanton mentioned, in the Unionesia judgment, and which will underpin my remarks today in terms of the danger of state-sanctioned incitement to genocide. And as it happens, we meet at an important moment of remembrance and reminder. It allows us to better frame our discussions here. We meet in the aftermath of the 60th anniversary of the Genocide Convention, sometimes spoken of as the Never Again Convention, but which has tragically been violated again and again. On the occasion of, and this is sometimes forgotten, the 15th anniversary of the unspeakable Rwandan genocide. Unspeakable because this genocide was preventable. Or close to 1 million Rwandans, mostly ethnic Tutsis and moderate Hutus, were murdered in less than 100 days, 15 years ago. And as we have entered upon the 6th anniversary of the genocide by attrition in Darfur, it's shocking to appreciate that the crime whose name we should even shudder to mention has found expression yet again in the 21st century, and that we are in the 6th anniversary of this killing field with no signs yet of abatement. And in the aftermath of what was declared in the United States in April as being Genocide Prevention Month, to be the occasion to remember, to recall, and to act upon the lessons of that genocide. And so, on this anniversary of anniversaries, one might say, of these moments of remembrance and reminder, we should ask ourselves, as we should always ask ourselves whenever we talk about the crime of crimes, what is it that we have learned? And no less important, what is it that we must do? I want to briefly summarize 5 lessons that have emerged over the last 60 years. There are others, but 5 foundational lessons which will lead me into the theme of my talk on the danger of state-sanctioned incitement to genocide. And the first is that very theme itself, and that is the danger of state-sanctioned incitement to genocide morphing into the genocide itself. In other words, the enduring lesson of the Holocaust and the genocides that followed in Srebrenica, in Rwanda, in Darfur, is that these genocides occurred not simply because of the machinery of death, but because of state-sanctioned cultures of hate. It is this demonizing of the other, this teaching of contempt, this is where it all begins. As the Supreme Court of Canada put it early in the Andrews case, reaffirmed it later in the Mugesera case, and as it has been echoed in international judgments, the Holocaust, or the other genocide one might also incorporate by reference, the Holocaust did not begin in the gas chambers, said the court. It began with words. These are the chilling facts of history. These are the catastrophic effects of racism. In other words, genocide, and this is something that has been best appreciated by Professor Stanton, whose writings I will get to in a moment. Genocide is not a spontaneous eruption. It's not the inevitable result of ancient hatreds. It is the result of a genocidal process, of precursors to genocide, where incitement, and in particular the state-sanctioned character of that incitement, underpins these precursors. In fact, Professor Stanton, in his template of the 8 stages of genocide, sets forth the dynamic evolution of these precursors. After identifying the initial steps of classifying the victim group as another and developing a system to symbolize such difference, Professor Stanton explains the transformative impact of dehumanization. And here I quote, "Classification and symbolization are fundamental operations in all cultures. They become steps of genocide only when combined with dehumanization. Denial of the humanity of others is a step that permits killing with impunity. The universal human abhorrence of murder of members of one's own group is overcome by treating the victims as less than human. In incitements to genocide, the target groups are called disgusting animal names. Under Nazi propaganda, Jews referred to as vermin, Rwandan Hutu, Hadrada referring to the Tutsis as cockroaches. The targeted group, in other words, is often likened to a disease, microbes, infections, or to cancer in the body politic. In this genocidal process, as Professor Stanton points out, through stereotyping and singling out, dehumanization and demonization, would-be victims of genocide are identified, segregated out, and targeted. In the context of these precursors to genocide, delegitimization, dehumanization, demonization, genocidal incitement emerges almost as commonplace rather than as offensive. The banality of evil is thus set in motion. In turn, the calls themselves become more and more inflammatory as the projected destruction of the victim is made to seem even more natural, if not preordained. Moreover, as Professor Stanton points out, during the period that the genocidal incitement is ignored or dismissed as mere rhetoric, the would-be genocidaires exploit the opportunity to accumulate the means to carry out genocide. Indeed, as Professor Stanton notes, the stage of dehumanization comes even before the genocidaires plan and organize the genocide. It is success during the stage of dehumanization that effectively empowers the genocidaires to continue the process. Impunity breeds contempt for law, as he put it, and emboldens genocidaires who can literally get away with murder. As well, despite the elaborate efforts to orchestrate the genocide, would-be genocidaires, as we know, are equally consistent in developing a narrative of denial about the very intentionality with respect to genocide. Indeed, with all the other conditions in place, the would-be genocidaires deny the reality that they have started down the road to genocide, implicitly recognizing that the international community, which is outside the dehumanizing and demonizing process, which is outside the genocidal web of hate, would clearly object to such genocidal intentionality. Accordingly, the world finds itself duped into complicity until it is too late. The seeds of hate planted years ago are ignored, sanitized, or dismissed as unimportant, even though they will soon morph into tragedy. Because the genocide has not occurred, the international community continues to proclaim that there is no genocide, thus ignoring that the genocidal path has already been embarked upon and the responsibility to prevent is already there. And we are reminded of this again in the recent judgment in the Mugesera case, where in that judgment the court says that there need not be and there is not any causality between the intentionality and the result. In other words, incitement itself constitutes the crime. One does not have to wait until that morphs into the tragedy of the genocide itself. And in each of the instances to which I've referred, each of the genocidaires had already gone down that path of the precursors to genocide, but without any interposition of the responsibility to prevent. Which leads me to the second lesson, and that is the danger of inaction, of indifference and inaction in the face of such incitement, let alone in the face of the mass atrocity which subsequently may ensue. As I mentioned with regard to Rwanda, what made the horror of that genocide so unspeakable is that it was preventable. Nobody can say that we did not know. We knew, but we did not act. Just as no one can say with respect to Darfur that we did not know. We knew, but we did not act, and still are not sufficiently acting. As Elie Wiesel put it so well, so many times, that indifference always means coming down on the side of the victimizer, never on the side of the victim. Which leads me to the third lesson, the danger of the culture of impunity. If the 20th century was the age of atrocity, it was also the age of impunity. Few of the genocidaires, few of the perpetrators were brought to justice. And so just as there must not be any sanctuary for hate, any refuge for bigotry and incitement, so must there not be any sanctuary for these hostis humanus genus, for these enemies of humankind. And I regret that, you know, if one thinks of anniversaries, we are a little past the second anniversary, where the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for Ahmed Haroun, the Minister of Humanitarian Affairs in Sudan. But rather than Sudan surrendering Ahmed Haroun to the International Criminal Court as required, he was promoted to be the minister in charge of hearing human rights complaints from the very victim against whom he perpetrated his atrocities, which acted, of course, as precedent, if not Orwellian principle, for the recent aftermath of when the International Criminal Court issued its first arrest warrant ever for a sitting head of state, President al-Bashir of Sudan. Once again, the response has been a culture of impunity. Indeed, even feted in various Arab and African capitals, where the international responsibility with regard to that kind of criminality was to surrender him to the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. Indeed, with regard to the question of incitement to genocide, let it be clear that the international legal system has codified, beginning with the Genocide Convention, a prohibition against the direct and public incitement to genocide. These words not only find themselves in the Genocide Convention, in Article 3 of the Genocide Convention, they are repeated in the statutes that establish the international criminal tribunals for former Yugoslavia and Rwanda. They are reaffirmed in the statute for an international criminal court, where the court is authorized to exercise jurisdiction in matters of direct and public incitement to genocide. In other words, the prohibition against the direct and public incitement to genocide is what international lawyers sometimes in their burdensome Latin call jus cogens, overriding international law, erga omnes, invocable against all, by any state, against any other state. Long before we codified through the UN Security Council, some 2.5 years ago, the responsibility to protect doctrine, we codified in the Genocide Convention the responsibility to prevent principle as an authoritative norm of international law, which the responsibility to protect a principle only underpins and reaffirms. But the responsibility to prevent, the first constituent of the responsibility to protect, was anchored in international law as early as in the Genocide Convention, which provided precedent and principle for the international judgments from Nuremberg through former Yugoslavia, through Rwanda, Darfur, and the like, and ending up in the Supreme Court of Canada in the Mugesera judgment in 2005. Which leads me now to a fourth lesson. And the fourth lesson is la trahison des clercs, the betrayal of the elites. In other words, if one looks at the Nazi Holocaust, it was not only, as Robert Lifton would refer to it, though he was not only referring to it as being that, the bureaucratization of genocide, but it was the genocide as perpetrated by the elites. Lawyers, judges, doctors, engineers, architects, educators, as Elie Wiesel put it so well here again, that the Nuremberg crimes were the crimes of the Nuremberg elites. What it showed is that one could both love poetry and kill children at the same time. One has only to read Mueller's book on Hitler's justice to see the complicity of lawyers and judges in the Third Reich. One only has to read Proctor's work to understand the complicity of the medical profession who became the gatekeepers to the death camps. One only has to read Robert Jan van Pelt's work to understand and appreciate the minute involvement of engineers and architects in the design of Auschwitz and the death camps, and so on. And so this fourth lesson, la trahison d'éclair. And I would say at the pinnacle of la trahison d'éclair today are those governments to whom we entrust our security and our liberty, who become part of this trahison d'éclair, therefore the state-sanctioned incitement to genocide, and even the United Nations itself. And I grew up as a child of the United Nations. For me, the United Nations was and remains even an organizing idiom of Canadian foreign policy, where international law is the centerpiece of our commitment, where we march under the banner of human rights. And yet, what one finds with respect to the United Nations, set up to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, the United Nations itself, particularly in the United Nations Council on Human Rights, has ended up singling out one member state of the international community for differential and discriminatory treatment, in this instance Israel, because out of the 32 first resolutions of condemnation adopted by the UN Human Rights Council in its first 3 years of operation, 26 were directed against one member state. But the more disturbing dynamic is that the major human rights violators during this entire period have enjoyed exculpatory immunity. Not one resolution of condemnation, not against Iran, not against Sudan, not against China, and I can go on. And it's that which makes the United Nations Council on Human Rights partake of, if you will, la trahison d'éclair. And which brings me to the final lesson, and that is the vulnerability of the powerless and the powerlessness of the vulnerable. Found in the triage of Nazi racial hygiene, in the Nazi race laws, in the euthanasia program, where what one found in that entire triage there was the notion of lives that are not worth living. And as Professor Henry Friedlander set forth in his work on the origins of genocide, the first group that was singled out for genocide were the Jewish disabled, reminding us always of our need to give voice to the voiceless as we empower the powerless. And so the fifth lesson, therefore, and that is the danger of the vulnerability of the powerless. All these come together and underpin what is going to be the case study that I'm going to speak of today, and that is the state-sanctioned incitement to genocide in Ahmadinejad's Iran. I say Ahmadinejad's Iran because I want to distinguish this from the people and publics of Iran, who are otherwise themselves the massive targets of domestic repression in Iran, symbolized by the religious minority, the Baha'i, who have particularly been targeted for state-sanctioned hate, exclusion, and oppression, and which has intensified of late. But it is not only, though they are the most dramatic example of it, not only the Baha'i, but one finds this also with respect to the oppression regarding women and students and academics and other ethnic and religious minorities and the like. I might add that Professor Stanton was a witness recently before our Foreign Affairs Parliamentary Subcommittee on Human Rights, which is now has been undertaking a study of the threat of a nuclear genocidal and rights violating Iran. And he testified under the rubric of the genocidal incitement component of our inquiry, and made the point that Iran has already passed through the first 6 stages of genocide in his 8 template stages of genocide. In other words, what we are witnessing in Iran today is the toxic convergence of the advocacy of the most horrific of crimes, namely genocide, embedded in the most virulent of hatreds, namely anti-Semitism, dramatized by the parading in the streets of Tehran, not once, but many times, and not only in the streets of Tehran, but Shihab 3 missile draped in the emblem with the words, you've read about it, wipe Israel off the map, but perhaps not the other 4 words, as the Imam says, namely that this is a religiously inspired incitement to genocide, and warning Muslims that if they will recognize Israel, they will burn in the Ummah of Islam. And what makes the Iranian case study distinguishable from all the others that I mentioned, from the Holocaust to Rwanda, Srebrenica, Darfur, and the like, are 2 factors. The first is, in each and all of the other cases, tragically, the genocide has already occurred. Only with respect to Iran is there the state-sanctioned incitement to genocide, the responsibility to prevent it, which has not yet occurred in terms of the genocide itself, but where the duty to act is overriding and compelling. The second thing is that, as with respect to Rwanda, the killing fields took place through the use of machetes. What we're seeing with Iran today is the danger of the convergence of both the incitement with the evolution into becoming an atomic power. And while most, if not all, of the discussion with respect to prevention has dealt with the issue of Iran becoming a nuclear power, and there have been 3 sets of UN Security Council resolutions and attending sanctions in relation to that, there has been very little, in fact, no discussion at the United Nations Security Council by way of resolution and sanction with respect to the genocidal part. And yet it is the genocidal incitement that provides the terrifying context for that which can ensue. In other words, once again, it is the incitement that is being sanitized, ignored, obscured, deflected, rationalized, whatever. And so what I would like to do at this point are 2 things. Number 1, set before you a summary of the precursors to genocide in Ahmadinejad's Iran. Identify and summarize these precursors to genocide, and really adopting and anchoring myself in the template that Professor Stanton developed, in particular with respect to a number of these dynamics: delegitimization, dehumanization, demonization, denial, and the like. And secondly, set forth the particular remedies, the remedies that are mandated by international law, so that the responsibility to prevent can be translated into a duty to act. In discussing these precursors to genocide, I want to make one point, which I draw here on my own experience. As someone who has been engaged in the prosecution of Rwandans for incitement to genocide and filed briefs in the international criminal tribunals for former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, that has studied also the incitement in the Nazi Holocaust and the like, I can tell you, and I know that this is going to sound both surprising, if not maybe hardly credulous, but I can tell you, and I'm going to try to go through this in a manner to underpin what I'm now saying. The precursors to genocide, the precursors of incitement to genocide in Ahmadinejad's Iran are as great, if not exceeding, those that occurred in the other incitement experiences which led us down the road to genocide. So let me now begin with the summarizing of the precursors, and I said I'm going to be anchoring myself very much in as backdrop and an intellectual, juridical context with Professor Stanton's template and his brilliant testimony before our committee. The first is the principle, the precursor of delegitimization and exclusion. Simply put, genocide, as we know, is a crime almost unfathomable in its cruelty and its scale. It is impossible to perpetrate against victims that appear to the génocidaire as human. As Helen Fine has noted, the potential victims must be seen as being outside the boundaries of the universe of obligation. Therefore, the first step is to classify the other, the targeted state and its people in this instance, as illegitimate and unworthy of this universe of obligation, singling them out for oppression and opprobrium, characterizing them as a forged nation, as a fabricated people warranting their demise. In the words of the Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, and note here what might be even the specific anti-Semitic tropes that underpin this first precursor, as he says as follows, directing himself to the Jewish nation. Quote, "What are you? A forged government and a false nation. They gathered wicked people from all over the world and made something called the Israeli nation. Is that a nation? All the malevolent and evil Jews have gathered there. Those Jews who went to Israel were malevolent, evil, greedy thieves, and murderers." And just as the leadership in Iran often uses the euphemism Zionism, which is more a rebuke than a nomenclature of respect, here it is characterizing the forged, fabricated people directly as being evil Jews in this first precursor of delegitimization of civilization and exclusion. From this singling out and delegitimization of the alien other, one moves to the dehumanization of Israelis and Jews through the use of epidemiological metaphors, reminiscent of Nazi-like dehumanization of the Jews. Indeed, in the genocide fostering process, as Professor Stanton has pointed out, these biological euphemisms are not just rhetorical instruments of incitement. They seek to preclude the intended victims from even being considered human to begin with. And so, as I mentioned, just as Jews were labeled as vermin by the Nazis and the Tutsis were labeled as cockroaches in Rwanda, so too have Israelis and Jews been dehumanized and labeled in Iran as a filthy germ and savage beast. I don't even want to go through the entire set of epidemiological metaphors. In fact, Professor Richter has tracked this in a chronological fashion in terms of the timelines of incitement and the uses of such metaphors. But one should note that these are not idle rhetoric that are being said in private conversation. The reference that one finds to each of these things are also being propagated and disseminated in the Iranian radio, television, Islamic news agencies, and the like. And so here it is that Israel and Jews are referred to as a filthy germ and savage beast, as a black and filthy microbe, as a cancerous tumor, as a stain of disgrace on the garment of Islam, as a stinking corpse, and one can go on. But I think you appreciate the point here in this dehumanizing rhetoric to place them outside the zone of obligation, following on the first precursor of delegitimization, and now going to the third, which is the moving from dehumanization to demonization, where the Jew is portrayed as a dangerous, diabolical devil, as a Satan-like figure. In a word, dehumanization coupled with demonization accomplishes the dual purpose of making the would-be victim appear not only to be less than human, if not subhuman, but also to appear more threatening, more dangerous, more devil-like, and thereby providing a warrant for genocide. As when Ahmadinejad labels the Zionists as, quote, the true manifestations of Satan, as the most detested people in all of humanity, and where the Iranian news channel again and again says that next to the Jews, all the criminals of the world appear to be righteous. Which brings me now to the fourth precursor, and that is that of Holocaust denial, or genocide denial. Again referred to in Professor Stanton's template, which need not come only at the end of the process, but can come in the course of the process of incitement. And here you have it in the form of Holocaust denial, the assault on Jewish memory, truth, and justice. In a word, if the first precursors of genocide delegitimization, dehumanization, and demonization act as prologue and justification for Hamid's genocide, if these are not enough, the vocabulary of hate in Ahmadinejad's Iran also denies the Nazi Holocaust, while it incites to a new one, which it also claims to be denying on the road to that incitement. In fact, Holocaust denial is another particularly powerful tool in the quest to demonize Israel and the Jews. For it not only denies the Holocaust of the Jews, and again referred to recently by Ahmadinejad at the podium of the United Nations Review Conference, Durban II, as it was called in Geneva. Not only is there the denial of Jewish suffering, but also accusing the Jews of fabricating this hoax as part of an international criminal conspiracy in order to establish their false, fictitious, forged nation and people. As I said, a trope reaffirmed once again in Geneva, just as it was affirmed in last September before the United Nations General Assembly, leading to a fifth precursor, and Professor Gregory Gordon, who's here, has written eloquently about this. And this is the false accusation in the mirror, which becomes yet another warrant for genocide. Holocaust denial in Iran, with its inherent conspiracy theory that the Jews used the Holocaust to usurp Muslim land in the Middle East, fits neatly with the false paradigm of what genocide experts have called the accusation in the mirror principle. Simply put, genocidaires invoke this strategy to convince their target audience that if the diabolical and murderous other is not attacked first, then the audience will fall victim to this diabolical other, thereby framing aggression as self-defense. A leitmotif used, as we know, and not only used but abused by the Nazis and the genocidaires in the Balkans, in Rwanda and Darfur. Moreover, as a precursor of incitement to genocide, it provides a necessary psychological justification for the genocide to be carried out. For not only is this alien other of whom we have been speaking illegitimate, inhuman, demonic, engaged in an international criminal conspiracy, but it is threatening to attack. It is threatening to attack not only Iran, but Islam. And therefore, the need, in the words of Ahmadinejad, where all this comes together, the need to regard Israel, quote, as a permanent threat, having been established to, quote, swallow up the entire region. And as he puts it, they kill women and children, young and old, and behind closed doors, they make plans for the advancement of their evil goals. Ugly words echoed by the commander of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard as follows: there is a need to excise this cancerous tumor called Israel, which was founded in order to plunder the Muslim nation. And so the sense here, as I said, of the false accusation in the mirror, which leads me to the sixth precursor, and moving to a close on the precursors, and this is the notion of the satanic Jews not only as enemies of Iran, not only as enemies of the Islamic world, not only as a stain on the garment of Islam, but as the poisoners of the international wells and a reaffirmation of the classic anti-Semitic tropes. And I will quote just one excerpt with respect to the classic anti-Semitic tropes as, well, let me just finish on this point before I move on to that. In terms of the satanic Jews as enemies of humanity, the struggle against these enemies of humanity, as I mentioned, becomes religiously ordained. It is the process by which the hidden 12th Imam can come into being. And so it gets a religious sanctification to it. Which leads me to a seventh, and I'll get to the anti-Semitic trope and leave it to the last, the seventh precursor, and that is the support for, financing of, and arming of not only terrorist proxies in the forms of Hezbollah and Hamas, but I suspect that if any of us actually read the charter of Hamas, the programs of Hezbollah, we would find that what we have here are not simply terrorist entities, but terrorist entities that have a genocidal objective, not because I say so, but because they affirm it, an anti-Semitic ideology, a terrorist instrumentality, and a global reach. And that's what makes the symmetry of their genocidal incitement a reflection and representation and mandatory of its patron, Iran. And this brings me to the last precursor, which is the classical anti-Semitic tropes that I refer to with respect to incitement to genocide. And I'm going to just refer to one, as I mentioned, only one where the reference is clearly not to Israel, to Zionists, but to Jews as the poisoners of the international wells, and in the words of the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, and the words are as follows, and I quote, "But among the Jews, there have always been those who killed God's prophets and who opposed justice and righteousness. Throughout history, this religious group has inflicted the most damage on the human race, while some groups within it engage in plotting against other nations and ethnic groups to cause cruelty, malice, and wickedness. Historically, there are many accusations against the Jews. For example, it was said that they are the source of such deadly diseases as the plague and typhus. This is because the Jews are very filthy people. For a time, people also said that they poisoned water wells belonging to Christians and thus killed them, and so on. I can go on. I don't want to burden you with these kinds of excerpts, other than to convey to you that we are in the midst of classical anti-Semitic tropes. Yet another precursor that underpins the state-sanctioned incitement to genocide, and which is disseminated throughout Iran and beyond in all forms of the media available to them. And all these eight precursors converge and underpin the clear and express, it's not ambiguous, it's not in terms of the references in Rwanda to the revolution of 1954 to the Inyenzi, into clear, unequivocal calls for incitement to genocide as follows, and I quote, "Iran's stance has always been clear on this ugly phenomenon, Israel. We have repeatedly said that this cancerous tumor of a state should be removed from the region." Not Ahmadinejad saying this, but the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. Again, now Ahmadinejad, but quoting the Ayatollah Khomeini, the initial founder of the Islamic Revolution. Ayatollah Khomeini's ideals are about to be materialized today. The Zionist regime is at a total dead end. God willing, this desire will soon be realized, and this epitome of perversion will disappear off the face of the earth. And then finally, again, repeated again and again, by the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, with all the ramifications when this comes from the affirmation of the supreme leader, put as follows: there is only one solution to the Middle East problem, namely the annihilation and destruction of the Jewish state, repeated again and again. Which leads me now to the second part, and I'll summarize this quickly, and that is, what then is to be done? Or more importantly, what is to be done? As I said, there should not be any mistake about it. Ahmadinejad's Iran has already committed the crime of incitement to genocide under the Genocide Convention and international law. It is already gone down the road to genocide. The question at this point is, what will the international community do? I put it in the future tense because as we meet, not one state party in the international community, not one state party to the Genocide Convention, notwithstanding that it is Jus Kogan's overriding international law, a clear responsibility to prevent, a clear duty to act, in all the principles and precedents from Nuremberg to Darfur, the Canadian Supreme Court, and the like, not one state party has undertaken any of the remedies to combat this state-sanctioned incitement to genocide as mandated by international law. Not one has undertaken the even modest initiative of simply referring this state-sanctioned incitement to genocide to any of the United Nations organs for account as mandated under Article 8 of the Genocide Convention. Not one state party has undertaken a complaint, a civil complaint, against another state party to the Genocide Convention, like Iran, because Iran is a state party to the Genocide Convention, obliged by that convention, has undertaken a complaint for violation of the prohibition against incitement to genocide and taken that complaint before the International Court of Justice. Even though, as Madam Justice Louise Arbour, former United Nations Commissioner on Human Rights, referred to the prevention of incitement to genocide not only as Jus Cogens overriding law, but as justiciable, as that which can and must be also remedied by resort to the courts, in this instance to the International Court of Justice. Not one state party has put any of the leaders of Iran, any of them, on an inadmissible list, on a watch list, as being inadmissible for their ongoing involvement in state-sanctioned incitement to genocide. And I find it not only anomalous, but absurd that as I'm speaking to you, Meher Arar, a Syrian Canadian, who after a commission of inquiry in Canada was determined not only to have been the victim of the innocent victim of three governments, the United States government, which detained him and rendered him to Syria when he was on his way back from Europe to Canada. He's a Syrian Canadian. The Syrian government which tortured him, and Canadian officials who provided false information to the United States officials that he was associated with Al-Qaeda and radical Islam. After the Commission of Inquiry set up in Canada said that he was not only innocent, but the innocent victim of all three governments, and after the Canadian Parliament and the Canadian government apologized to Meher, and after he was indemnified in $10 million for these false accusations and the like, he still remains on the U.S. watch list as we meet, and has a case before the courts, American courts in that regard, in which, to make full disclosure, I'm also involved on his behalf as an amicus intervenor. But the anomaly, the crude and cruel anomaly, that Meher Arar is on the U.S. watch list, but not one of the Iranian leaders engaged in sustained incitement to genocide are on that watch list. And so tomorrow in the Canadian Parliament, I'm going to be introducing legislation called the Iran Accountability Act to set up a framework for the monitoring of state-sanctioned incitement to genocide, to authorize appropriate actions, including sanctions with respect to such incitement, to connect the dots between the incitement, the nuclear, and the rights of violating Iran, converging all together as part of the precursors to genocide, of setting forth the dangers of these precursors to genocide, and calling upon the Canadian government and the international community to act so as to combat this incitement to genocide. Let there be no mistake about it as well. Not only has Iran started down the road to genocide and committed the crime of genocide, but the international community continues to be indifferent and inaction in the face of such incitement. In times such as these, as the French put it, qui s'accuse, that whoever remains indifferent indicts himself or herself. So I hope that this International Association of Genocide Scholars meeting will not only be, as it is when we gather together, an act of remembrance of past genocides, but an act also of the remembrance to act so as to prevent the incitement which can take us down the road to a further genocide. Thank you.
Thank you. Please identify yourself.
Okay, my name is Jonathan Alshet. I come from Israel, from the Open University and Tel Aviv University. So I think I'm allowed in a way, too critical for what you're saying, as I am coming from Israel.
I invite you to be critical.
Okay, by all means.
Could you put the mic, I think the mic's on.
It is, it is.
Okay, okay.
Just hold it up close.
I think it should have been appropriate to mention that Israel has certain ministers within the Knesset that are using certain phrases, are using certain ideas. I think it should have been mentioned that Israel is threatening Iran as well. I think it should have been mentioned that Iran has not killed any Jew up until now, and this cannot be said for Israel. I think that its human rights discourse and genocide discourse should protect the powerless. And I fear the use of human rights discourse and genocide discourse in order to empower those that are already in power. I think those things should concern us. Of course, I agree with a lot of what you said. Ahmadinejad is intolerable and should not be allowed by all means. And yet it's crucial always to remember that Israel is not an idle victim. We used to be powerless victims. We are not powerless victims anymore. And I think it's dangerous not to mention that. Thank you.
Yeah, John, I'll take your time.
I think what's happened in the world is that that Israel, which used to be the victim, Israel has lost the propaganda war, and Israel is labeled a genocide there. This is what's happened. I think it's a mixture of words and images, and I mean I agree to something with the colleague who spoke before. We've lost the propaganda war. The Jews are the genocidalists, and not the other side. If you look at Hamas, you look at not just Iran, but many places, their words are genocidal, but no one ever criticizes them.
Take one more.
Shimon Samuel.
Okay, sir.
Simon Wiesenthal, Senator Erwin. I think my question might feed into the point made by Mr. Alsher in saying that Iran has killed no Jews. 85 Jews killed and 250, including innocent passers-by in Buenos Aires in 1994 at the Amia Jewish Center. Hezbollah in Latin America, which will be the subject of my paper here. And what I would like to ask you, Erwin, is this. I'm sorry I don't know if you covered it, but the fact that Argentina has taken a stand in demanding the indictments and arrest of 8 Iranians, including former President Rafsanjani and former Foreign Minister Velayati, from the podium of the General Assembly of the United Nations to Argentine presidents have made that call. How does that factor into your cause, your campaign?
Okay, let me take each of the questions serially. First of all, I'm not an Israeli. I'm dealing with state-sanctioned incitement to genocide in Ahmadinejad's Iran. I'm dealing with a panoply of precursors, all 8 of them, which, as I say, are without parallel or precedent in any other experience which we've had with state-sanctioned incitement to genocide. This does not mean that I would acquiesce in or would not otherwise criticize a minister or ministers in Israel who make racist remarks. They should be held to account. It's a democracy. There's not the precursors of the state-sanctioned incitement to genocide in Israel, even in Netanyahu's Israel, if I want to use that term. And I find sometimes that the responses in Israel are more governed by the internal ideological wars and the politics of divide in Israel than they may be about what is otherwise the nature of the subject matter at issue. It's a separate issue if one wants to criticize, and one can criticize, intemperate, even racist remarks by an Israeli minister. But there's no moral equivalence between what is happening in a state-sanctioned incitement to genocide in Ahmadinejad's Iran and what takes place in Israel, where in a democracy people can be held to account, and the ballot box can also hold them to account. Let me go to Jack's point. I think that this is an interesting comment in terms, as you mentioned, about Israel today being accused of genocide. I say this because, when we talk about the 60th anniversary, I could have said that, the 60th anniversary of Israel dovetailed with the 60th anniversary of the Genocide Convention and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. If one looks at it, there is a kind of symbolic, if almost symbiotic relationship between all these three. In other words, if the Genocide Convention was the Never Again Convention, if Never Again underpinned the Genocide Convention, then Israel was a state born of that commitment. If at the time of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights it was held out as the Magna Carta of human rights, and Israel held out at the time as being a light onto the nations, was in a kind of symbiotic relationship then with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. 60 years later, that symbolic and symbiotic relationship has been turned on its head. For not only is the state of Israel and its people one of the only states and people that are themselves the target today of state-sanctioned incitement to genocide, but they are one of the only states and peoples that are systematically accused themselves of committing a genocide. And we saw this in particular during the Israel-Hamas war and the juxtaposition of the tropes justifying Hamas on the grounds that Israel was in fact committing genocide against Hamas. And with respect to human rights, the same thing. That which was held out to be a light onto the nations is today singled out as a meta human rights violator. And I can tell you, somebody who's in terms of being a professor of human rights law, as almost being held out as the new antichrist of humankind, as a systematic violator of human rights. But none of this should act as an exculpatory means of somehow legitimating what goes on in Ahmadinejad's Iran because of our own felt concerns about what may be going on in Israel. False moral equivalences are dangerous. They're sloppy moral judgments, and they prevent the moral clarity that is needed in order to go after the real genocide. And your point, Shimon, that you mentioned about Argentina, I didn't mention it, it's in my paper, I didn't mention it, but it's interesting that the arrest warrants, which have been issued, Alberto Nissan as special prosecutor asked the court, Argentinian court issued the arrest warrants. It found, of course, not only that Iran had organized and perpetrated and planned and perpetrated the bombing of the Amia Jewish Community Center in 1994, but in fact it had been executed by Hezbollah agents on the orders of Iran. What's disturbing is that whereas the Argentinian judiciary, has issued arrest warrants, as you mentioned, for former President Rafsanjani, the international community has not followed up and has continued to indulge the culture of impunity by not, in fact, invoking arrest warrants. And it's not only for the community center in Argentina, it also has to do with assassinations that took place in Germany and so on. The fingerprints of the Iranian incitement and subsequent killing find expression not only with regard to the targeting of Israel and the Jewish people, but in fact in extraterritorial assassinations and the like that have taken place both in Europe and in Argentina. Ellie, did you have?
Yeah. Actually, Shimon did ask most of the points that I wish to ask, but let me reinforce what he had to say. during the 1990s, and still for that matter, I've had quite a few projects in public health and preventive medicine with my Palestinian colleagues. In fact, I'd probably say I'm looking around, I may be the only person in this room who has those projects. And I can say that in the 1990s, my counterparts and third-party actors, clergymen and so on and so forth, were very aware of the way the capacity to carry out these projects was undermined by sinister Iranian attempts to sabotage them through all kinds of incitement below the radar screen. Now, this is the kind of thing that doesn't quite make it up to the front pages, but it's still present. You see nothing of the equivalence on our side. I was frankly quite shocked by your remarks. I also would like to say that I saw an echo in your remarks of the indifference to the facts on the ground that emerged in that famous listserv debate that occurred in this organization several months ago. Not only in Venice, not only in Argentina, but through the terror proxies, Hezbollah and Hamas. There have been assaults on the Israeli population with the intention to kill in whole and apart. The fact that, quote, relatively few, whatever that means, people have been killed does not pertain to the lack of intent, but simply to the fact that we make it our business to protect our citizenry. We use shelters to shield children, and we don't use children to shelter terrorists who are carrying out these genocidal acts. And I think the record has to be straight on those points.
My own comment on that is I think as best as possible when one is dealing with, on the one hand, the danger of state-sanctioned incitement to genocide as an empirical phenomenon, and is set forth in Professor Stanton's template on the 8 stages of genocide. And when one deals with the juridical responsibility to prevent such incitement, as set forth in international law and the duty to act, it's best to try not to politicize that framework with the Israeli-Palestinian-Arab conflict. Because I think when one does that, it tends to act as a kind of diversion and deflection away from that which has to be frontally addressed. There are plenty of forms in which the Israeli-Palestinian-Arab conflict in all its configurations needs to be addressed. But whatever Israel may be doing or not doing cannot act as an exculpatory framework for the precursors to genocide. Because then we get to the point that I mentioned earlier in my remarks of indifference and inaction in the face of incitement. And that itself constitutes the crime of genocide. I want to thank you all for your questions, comments. I'll try to incorporate them into the final paper. And as I say, whenever I come to these exercises, I'm the beneficiary of the exchanges. It will help refine what I'm doing. Thanks very much.